Our next session is sponsored by DGR Engineering. Thanks to DGR for sponsoring this. We appreciate your support. Next speaker is Jack Cagle. Jack has served as MMUA's executive director since 1993. Prior to coming to MMUA, Jack was the in-house lawyer, lobbyist, and utility infielder for the Iowa Association of Municipal Utilities. Jack began his career in the utility energy field by representing consumers in energy and utility matters. Jack is a graduate of the University of Illinois College of Law and has been admitted to practice of law in Minnesota, Iowa, and Illinois. Please welcome Jack Cagle.
Well, thank you, Vernell. Good morning, and it's very exciting to be here. I originally planned this to be a session that focused on MMUA history. And as I was thinking through it, I thought, well, you know, it would really make a lot of sense to also spend a little bit of time on the developments in the industry that led to the development of MMUA. And then I thought, well, you know, you really need to go back to the 19th century and the development of electricity as a force in people's lives. So we're going to start a little early. We'll walk through the early stuff pretty quickly, but let's start at the beginning. Ben Franklin and his kite. If you look in the upper left, you'll see that Ben is drawing an arc from his key on his kite string to his knuckle. That confirmed that the air in a thunderstorm is charged with electricity, that lightning actually is electricity. And interestingly, it led to the development of lightning rods. So we're a long way from being able to harness electricity, but we're actually beginning to learn how to protect ourselves from it. So move ahead a little bit. About 1800 in Italy, Alessandro Volta developed the voltaic pile battery, and you can see a picture of it in a museum there. It was basically zinc and copper discs, and each pair of discs was a cell. And it was the first battery that was able to produce a continual source of power. So we're beginning to harness this new mysterious force. Move ahead a few years. In 1809, the carbon arc light is demonstrated. If you look at the picture, you'll see that it's basically just an arc between two poles attached to a bunch of batteries. Not the sort of thing you would want to use in your home. Not very practical until much later. It never was used indoors. But time marches on, and in 1831, Michael Faraday in England develops the first practical electric generator. So now we're able to produce electricity using mechanical means, not just chemical means. And not long after that, in 1844, the Woolwich electric generator is the first generator to actually power an industrial process. It was used in an electroplating process. And in the same year, 1844, Samuel Morse sends his first telegraph message. So we're starting to learn to use electricity. And by 1866, the transatlantic telegraph cable is in place, and soon telegraph cables are circling the globe. And by 1883, the eruption of Krakatoa in Indonesia is the first natural disaster that the world knew about in real time. Before this, if something like that happened in that part of the world, it would have taken weeks or months for the people in the United States to hear about it. And they knew about it within a few hours because of the telegraph cable powered by this new force, electricity. But let's go back to 1875. We're 3/4 of the way through the century. We're beginning to learn to harness this new force. But basically, 3/4 of the way through the 19th century, our ancestors still live in a world lit only by fire. as their ancestors did hundreds of years ago. But things are changing. In 1876, Alexander Graham Bell makes the first telephone call. Think of it, between 1844 and 1876, we go from dots and dashes being sent in a code that only a few people in the world know how to use, to actually transmitting voices. So people can actually talk from one person on one end of town to another person on the other end of town. And soon they're talking to people on the other end of the country. And eventually they're talking to people on the other side of the world. So things are changing, and electricity is beginning to bring people together. And then in 1879, Thomas Edison develops the incandescent light bulb, and everything changes. Also in 1879, coincidentally, we have the first electric street lighting in the United States. It's basically just 12 lights around the public square in Cleveland. And if you look at the picture, one of them is still there. It's been preserved and it still works. It's kind of a milestone in our industry. And look what happens after the light bulb. Ada in 1876, Ortonville 1881, Springfield 1884. We move on through the 80s with Le Sueur, North St. Paul, Alexandria, into the early 90s with Litchfield, Granite Falls, Brainerd, Laverne. There's only room for so many names on the slide, but they continue to come. And there's a lot of municipal utilities by the time we reach the 20th century. The picture, by the way, is the Moorhead Generating Station in 1895. There is an early picture of the plant in Rochester. They're down below the generating floor, and another picture of the plant in Laverne. So plants are popping up all over the country and all over the state. But there is still a big question to be answered. We're moving electricity around on wires. Should the electric distribution system be AC or DC? George Westinghouse on the left was the proponent of AC, and Thomas Edison stuck to DC. Now, Westinghouse was beginning to kind of pull ahead in this race, but it wasn't really settled. And then came the 1893 World's Fair in Chicago. If you look at the picture, it was quite a thing. The greatest architects in the country came together to build these incredible buildings that were designed to last for 6 months and then be taken down. They were all temporary. But more importantly for us, the fair had 93,000 electric lights. Think about that, in 1893, 93,000 electric lights in a couple of square miles. And the big question was, is the distribution system for the fair going to be AC, Westinghouse, or DC, Edison? And the two companies fought tooth and nail to get the contract. In the end, it went to Westinghouse. The fair was powered by AC, and that basically answered the question for the country. And just for fun, I thought you might like to know that that fair produced the world's first Ferris wheel also. It was way bigger than the ones that we see. If you look at those cars, each one of them was about the size of a streetcar and held about 30 people. And the Ferris wheel wouldn't fit on the fairgrounds, so they put it in a park, kind of a long linear park that was called the Midway. And even today, 127 years later, if you go to the state fair to ride the Ferris wheel, you find it on the Midway. But back to electricity. Everybody wants access to the new electric service. Everybody wants a utility in their town. But towns faced a choice. Should it be a private power provider or a municipal utility? There was a lot happening. The situation was pretty fluid in those early days. Some towns began with a private provider and then decided that they would purchase the utility and make it a municipal service. Some towns began with municipal service and they were induced to sell out to a private provider. So lots of fluidity, lots of action in those days. And the private providers were growing and becoming stronger. And then a fellow named Samuel Insull came along. He had originally been Thomas Edison's private secretary, and he looked around and he said, you know, there's money in this. So he bought up a bunch of small utility companies around the Chicago area and built the Commonwealth Edison Company. He builds large central station generators to develop economies of scale. He introduces demand and energy metering, which was new. And then most importantly, he pioneered the idea of rate regulation. He agreed to regulated rates in return for recognition as a natural monopoly, so he didn't have any competitors. It allowed for incredible growth with little or no competition. So he was one of the giants of the early 20th century. And Sam had a pretty high opinion of himself. He also built the Chicago Civic Opera House. And this is what it looks like on the backside from across the Chicago River. It was kind of a monument to himself, and it's still known as Insull's Throne. But then the Depression came along in the 30s, and Sam lost everything and died broke. So maybe there is a little justice in the world. And also in the 30s, look what happened. MMUA is born. The picture you see is the cover of the first MMUA directory in 1933. And there's Guy Bassam of Fairmount, the first MMUA president. And why do you suppose at this point in time they decided that they needed an association? Well, it was the Depression. There was a lot of change going on. And municipals and IOUs were in a war over the future of the industry. Municipal ownership and the continuation of municipal ownership was really a survival issue. The IOUs had money and political power that a bunch of small towns scattered around Minnesota couldn't compete with. And the reason associations get formed is to deal with politics. So MMUA brought the power of a group to these battles and enabled municipals to stand up to the giants. That's what we are there for even today. And back in these early days, MMUA had no staff. All activities were conducted by member volunteers, and it's amazing what they were able to accomplish. The mission statement, as it were, in that early directory is unselfishly and wholeheartedly devoted to the progress of municipal ownership. And that's really what MMUA was for. And really, it's what we're for today. It really talks about what we do and what we're all about. There were lots of municipal utility sellouts in the early 20th century. 57 municipals were sold in the earlier years of the century. And in the last 60 years, only 8 have been sold. So it's really slowed down. Most of the ones who were sold were very small, 800 population or less, with flat or declining populations, no growth. And interestingly, if you look at the graph, sellouts become a lot less common after MMUA is established in 1931. The ability of MMUA to stand up for our little segment of the industry really made a difference. But then things got even more complicated. In 1935, FDR developed the Rural Electrification Administration. And then a year later, in 1936, the National Rural Electrification Act was passed by Congress. It paved the way for the development of the rural electric co-ops. Meeker Co-op in 1935 becomes the first Minnesota REC. And in those days, cities typically used a 2300 volt distribution system. And with the technology of the day, they could move power about 4 miles. The co-ops used a 7200 volt system that could move power about 40 miles back in those days. And basically, they're still using that same system today. So we're developing RECs around the state. They don't have a network of G&Ts like they do today. So where did that power come from? In many cases, it came from us. Municipal electric utilities were the first providers of wholesale power to 18 of the 48 co-ops that formed in Minnesota in the 30s and 40s. By 1941, about half of the wholesale power purchased by cooperatives came from municipal electric utilities. If you take a look at this chart, you see co-ops on the left, and you see their first provider on the right. Look at that list of towns. Benson, New Ulm, Sleepy Eye, Moose Lake, Two Harbors, Brainerd, Fairmont, Jackson, Lakefield, Tyler, Hutchinson, Litchfield, New Prague, Worthington, Hibbing, Rochester, Halstead, Springfield, Fairfax, Melrose, Wells. If you're from one of those towns, the next time you have coffee with your co-op manager and he or she is complaining about having to deal with municipals and expansion, you might mention that they wouldn't even be there if it weren't for you. Might be a fun conversation. So we're moving ahead now. We've come through the 40s and the 50s. It's 1968, and MMUA is still a volunteer organization, but St. Clair Beeman, who is a lobbyist in Minneapolis, becomes the first part-time executive director. The office is at Franklin and LaSalle in downtown. Agnes Kephart is the office secretary, and you see a picture of Agnes there. And we have searched high and low to find a picture of St. Clair, and we can't find one. I even went on Ancestry.com to see if anybody had posted a picture of him in a family tree, but no luck. So we have a lot to thank St. Clair for, but he's kind of the mystery man in our history. So when St. Clair comes on, things start to happen. That very year, we have an MMUA newsletter for the first time. It's called News and Views, and that's what it looked like back then. Basically typed and sent out by mail. And if you wonder why we formed or why we hired an executive director in 1968, look what happened in 1969. The co-ops make their first attempt to pass service territory legislation. The bill would have mandated assigned service territories and not allowed municipals to grow with their cities. The co-ops wanted exclusive territories because they were getting ready to build the Coal Creek Station in North Dakota, and they needed collateral for a loan from the REA. The municipals wanted to grow with their cities. The co-ops didn't want to allow that. And we were instrumental in stopping the legislation, at least for a while. But jump ahead 5 years to 1974, and then we get to the year of the grand bargain. At this time, IOUs wanted state rate regulation. If you can believe it, IOU rates were regulated through city franchises at that time. So if a utility served 100 different cities, they had 100 different rate regulators, which I think would have been a problem. The co-ops, as we already know, wanted service territory protection. They wanted a predictable revenue stream so that they could build Coal Creek. And the municipals basically said, okay, guys, you can have what you want, but we want to be able to grow with our cities. And surprisingly, everybody got what they wanted. Actually, in the bill, the IOUs and the cooperatives agreed to rate regulation. All utilities would be assigned a service territory and have the sole right to provide service to customers in that territory. And municipals were granted the ability to purchase the right to serve customers in annexed territory. And a little footnote to history, little known, 4 years later, the co-ops apparently decided that they didn't really like rate regulation all that much, and they went back and got themselves removed from regulation unless the co-op elects to be rate regulated. And today there is one rate regulated co-op in the state, Dakota Electric, which serves in the South Metro area. And if you ever hear from your co-op manager that they never agreed to this service territory expansion for municipal utilities, it was shoved down their throat. This is testimony from the co-op's general counsel when the bill was in the legislature. And he said, the bill allows municipally owned systems in the state to buy out the facilities of any power supplier that happens to be in their area if they extend their borders. In other words, we're preserving really the right of municipally owned systems to continue to expand with their corporate borders should annexations occur. So it was part of the deal. The co-ops got what they wanted, we got what we wanted, and it's still in the law today. One problem with the law was compensation wasn't defined. There are some factors in the law to be considered, but there's no hard numbers. And as we all know, that's been causing problems for getting close on to 50 years now. Moving into the 70s, I guess it was time for St. Clair to step away, and MMUA got its first full-time executive director in 1975. Dick Kirkham was his name. He had been the city administrator at Laverne, and they told him he could put the office anywhere he wanted, and he decided Buffalo made sense for him. And Dick was with MMUA through 1992. He was kind of having some health problems and decided it was time to call it a career. So he retired, and they did a search, and well, we'll get to that later. While Dick was still here in 1985, he developed MMUA's first member service program. The Job Training and Safety Program, which we still operate. It was MMUA's first member service program. And in those days, it was actually operated by Wadena Technical College, and the MMUA trainers were employees of the Wadena Votech, but it was a start. Service territory kind of becomes a thing in 1985. In the newsletter, there are reports that negotiations on compensation between us and the co-ops have not been going very well. And the statement that utilities whose customers were being acquired used that uncertainty to make what were considered to be exorbitant and unjustifiably high monetary claims for the customers. Does that sound familiar? Basically, co-ops and IOUs were satisfied with the way things were. They could make arguments to try to increase the compensation, and that's pretty much where we are today, 35 years later. We started to see service territory litigation. There have been a lot of cases. I'll just mention a few. The first significant one was the Olivia case in 1986. That established the principle that municipals would not have to make payment for areas that they were going to be owning and developing themselves, bearing that risk. And the case also said there should be no payment for bare ground, areas with no facilities or customers. In 1990, Wilmer was going to take some territory that had never been served. There was nobody in there, no facilities in there. And it was held that the co-op was entitled to serve that area, even though they never had. It kind of stretches the meaning of the phrase receiving service that's in the statute. Also in 1990, the first Rochester case, it was the first case to require for compensation for bare ground. So now we're paying for customers that don't exist yet. There were no facilities or customers in that area, but the PUC found that the area was receiving electric service. And Judge Jack Davies wrote kind of a famous dissent that warned the commissioners that they were getting into some dangerous territory, and this was not a good idea. There were a number of other cases over the next years, but let's move ahead to 2003. Buffalo had a case against Wright-Hennepin regarding an annexation. The hearing at the PUC went really well for the city. The administrative law judge accepted the city's valuation figures, but at that time, the PUC was chaired by a gentleman named Leroy Koppendrayer, who was a lifelong co-op customer. And under his leadership, the commission reversed the ALJ. The city wound up paying 19 mills, or 17.9 mills for existing customers, and about 28 mills for new customers, which was unheard of prior to that case. Municipals were typically paying 12 to 15 mills, maybe. So suddenly it's almost doubled. There was also a case in Grand Rapids, same year, same commission, similar result. They wound up paying about 30 mills or 3 cents per kilowatt hour. Moving on to 1993, MMUA got a new logo. If you look at the old one on the left, there's smoke coming out of a house chimney and smoke coming out of a smokestack. And even 27 years ago, that idea was becoming a little passé. So the board decided it was a time for a new logo. The logo you see on the right was developed then. It's basically the same logo we've been using since, except that we kind of reversed it and we made the graphic colored, so it had a little bit more color to it. And as I said, Dick Kirkham retired in 1992. The board did a search, and this guy showed up. I became the second full-time executive director. Didn't grow up here. I'm originally a Chicago boy. Got started representing consumers in the energy industry. I was working at the Iowa Association when the job came open. And you know, those Iowa winters just weren't cold enough. So I came up here and I have loved every minute of it. And by the way, if you're looking for somebody to blame for me showing up, that would be Dave Nelson there on the left. He was the board president when I got hired. And when I actually started the job, one of the first things I did was go to his retirement party. I hope I didn't drive him away. But that's Dave and me at his retirement party. And look at those ties. That was the 90s. So moving on. MMUA had a small staff at that time. Beside the executive director, there were 5 people. And or there were 4 people beside the executive director, and 3 of them turned out to be lifers. In the center of the screen, the senior employee at that time was Bonnie Hayes. Bonnie kind of had the role that Rita plays now. She was the office manager and the meeting planner. Bonnie, and she was our longest serving employee when she retired about 10 years ago. And sadly, Bonnie passed away earlier this year. We really miss her. And then the second most senior employee on the left-hand side of the screen was a young woman named Rita Kelly. I think that might be her middle school graduation picture. And of course, as you all know, Rita is still with us and she runs the place now. And on the right, the newest employee at the time was a young gentleman named Steve Downer, who was doing the newsletter and communications functions, and he still does that today. So 3 people who came and stayed for a very long time. And things started happening. First thing that happened was we brought the JTS program in-house. There were some things going on up at Wadena that would have made it difficult for them to continue operating the program. We figured out that it would actually be cheaper and easier for us to operate the program ourselves. And this was kind of a modest first step toward MMUA operating lots and lots of programs to assist the membership. The scholarship program also started in 1994. Tom Bovitz of Hibbing was the president then, and this was something that he really wanted to accomplish. So we got it done, and Tom passed away a few years after that. And so in 1998, the scholarship was named for Tom in his memory. Also, we made kind of a major decision at that point. I'd been around long enough to get the lay of the land, and I could see that there was lots and lots of opportunity, lots of things that MMUA could do to help the membership and build the organization. But then there was also lobbying in St. Paul. And the board and I talked about it, and I explained that I could see an enormous amount of growth in the organization if we wanted to move in that direction. But if I was acting as the lobbyist, it wasn't going to be possible to do that and grow the organization at the same time. And the board agreed, and in late 1994, we hired our first full-time government relations staff person, Linda Schutz. Linda was with us for 3 or 4 years and then moved on, but it established our ability to really up our game in government relations. Something else happened in 1994. News and Views became the resource, which you're familiar with today. Still comes out 11 times a year. And I get a kick out of the headline at the top of the page there. Industry change inevitable, says the first commissioner. That was 26 years ago, and he was certainly right. It never stops. In 1995, the feds were beginning to require drug testing of people in certain positions. It affected municipal utilities and cities. So MMUA started our drug and alcohol testing program. And we found that some new non-traditional members were interested in the program. There were lots of cities that needed to find a source of drug testing. So, as a result of that, in 1995, the membership approved a change in the bylaws and articles that allows water members to join the association as regular members. At the time, most of them wanted to join the association because of the drug testing consortium. Today, it's generally the safety management program that brings new water systems into the organization. And today, MMUA has 56 water utility members. Also in 1995, it was time to get a little closer to the city and the capital. In Buffalo, the office was about 55 miles from the capital. It basically, if you went to the capital, you weren't really going to get much else done that day. And unlike the 70s and 80s, by this time, we were spending a lot of time in St. Paul. My predecessor, Dick's attitude tended to be, if we don't show up, maybe they'll forget about us. But by the 90s, it wasn't working anymore. We chose the Plymouth area because it was reasonably convenient for staff who still lived in Buffalo. It's a straight shot down Highway 55. And the location right off I-94 was popular with the members because it enabled them to avoid downtown traffic. And we're still in that same general area today. In 1996, our head trainer decided to move on. So we were looking for somebody to head that part of the organization. And in walked Mike Willetts. I actually knew Mike. He was the utility manager at Winterset, Iowa, before coming up here, and had worked in a lot of different capacities. He was a line worker, he was a utility manager, and that broad industry experience is what we were looking for to position us to be able to start providing new services. He and I both saw a lot of opportunities, and we set out to make things happen, and they started happening pretty quickly. That same year, we launched the safety management program. We began with two groups, the West Central group, which kind of runs from Moorhead to Detroit Lakes down to Alexandria, that area. And also the East Central, which was basically municipals within driving range of the metro area. And we've seen gradual but steady growth over the years. We currently have 14 employees doing safety management. We're serving 119 cities, utilities, and a few other types of organizations. And in the picture there, you see Mike with our first two regional safety coordinators. On the left is Rudy Shai, who had just retired from Elbow Lake. And on the right is Mike Skurla. We're into the late 90s now, and the big buzzword was what was then called retail wheeling or industry restructuring. Retail wheeling was absolutely inevitable, and it was going to happen tomorrow, and everybody knew it. And I remember the PUC put together an industry restructuring working group. There were dozens and dozens of long, turgid working group meetings about how we were going to handle this new concept. I actually took to calling it the work release program. I was over there so much. Basically, we expected major battles against companies like Enron, which were around and lurking. And we needed a little bit more heft. So in 1998, MMUA added a second government relations staff person to be able to handle what we thought was going to be an incredible workload. And then, somewhat surprisingly, Enron imploded, and that ended the retail competition discussions in Minnesota for a while. But talk of retail competition is starting to come back. We hear it from the chamber folks pretty regularly. Back in those days, we didn't have MISO here. We had a predecessor organization called MAP, the Mid-Continent Area Power Pool. You can see the area served in the graphic there. And if you own transmission in our part of the country, you would want to belong to MAP. They ran the transmission system. But participating was very expensive, very time consuming. And at our suggestion, we said, couldn't you make it available for small towns or small utilities to come in as a group rather than having to join individually? They actually listened. They decided that was a good idea, and they implemented that. So we developed a joint membership for small systems that weren't part of a JA at that point. You can see the initial member group. Not all of them, as I recall, actually wound up joining, but that was the interest group we had. And eventually, MAP got swallowed up by MISO, which handles these functions today. And the MAP joint membership went away when MAP went away, but it played an important role in getting small utilities involved in operation of the transmission system. Along about the same time, suddenly mutual aid became a very large focus. We had two huge mutual aid events in the late 90s. First was the East Grand Forks flood in April of 1997. I remember those folks up there fighting a flood in a blizzard, only in Minnesota. And in East Grand Forks, something like 90% of the system was underwater, and they had just pretty much completed their transformation from an overhead system to an underground system. So tough times. And about a year later, the St. Peter tornado hit on March 29th, 1998. And about 80% of the electric system was on the ground in St. Peter, and the amount of devastation was just unbelievable. In both of those situations, Mike Willetts served as our mutual aid coordinator. Mike had done power line construction. He had experience in storm restoration. So he went down to help, and he wound up spending days and days on site in both places helping the utility get through the crisis. And he established the practice of MMUA staff acting as a mutual aid coordinator. So MMUA, if you get hit, will arrange for crews, figure out lodging, figure out where the meals are coming from, coordinate the restoration, if that's what you would like us to do. And basically it frees utility staff up to deal with media, customers, FEMA, everything that happens in a situation like that. We still do things that way, and it's kind of a unique service provided by MMUA. There aren't many states that handle mutual aid like we do. As our training programs and safety programs grew, the folks in South Dakota who have a very small association and they don't have programs like that, said, you know, we'd like to participate in your programs. So in 1998, we began admitting South Dakota municipals as associate members in the organization. They participate in schools, programs, safety management. We don't lobby for them. They handle that on their own, but they use our safety programs. And some North Dakota municipals also do. The picture there is Bruce Westergaard. He's our South Dakota Regional Safety Coordinator. Great guy, really smart. And our Minnesota membership probably never gets to meet him, so I thought you might like to see him. Also in 1998, again, we're thinking about Enron, and we're thinking about retail wheeling. We knew we might need to spend money on some experts or extra consultants, so the board established a legal and legislative fund to give us the potential funding to be able to do some things like that. We also got back together with the co-ops a few times in those years. In 1997, we were working with the co-ops to develop a joint consumer-owned utility position on industry restructuring. So we thought, well, let's see if we can tackle service territory at the same time. As it turned out, all the co-ops were interested in was having us agree to a date when our right to grow with our cities would expire. As you can imagine, that didn't go very far, and the effort really didn't produce anything. A few years later, in 2001, we got a letter from legislative leadership asking us to see if we can work things out and find a solution to service territory. So we agreed to mediation. We hired a mediation coach. We prepared an extensive binder of background materials. Our team walked in with the co-op team. They apparently did no preparation. They had no resource materials. And once again, all they wanted to talk about was ending our right to grow with our cities. So we had 3 meetings. The mediator basically said, this isn't going anywhere. And after 3 sessions, the process ended. Moving on to 1999, we had our first MMUA legislative rally at the Capitol. The event has grown and matured over the years, and it's actually become really popular with legislators. We do an evening reception, and they love to come and spend some time with folks from home. They always give us high marks for it, and it's become a very important part of our year, and we certainly hope we don't have to figure out a way to do that one virtually when the legislative session rolls around again. 1999 was also a very big year because we began the process of building our training center. The city of Marshall was beginning to develop a fire and police training center on some industrial land, and the idea of developing an MMUA training center on an adjacent site came up. We were interested. The city offered us a 20-year lease for about 19 acres of land. We got to work on fundraising. We actually began construction on the building that fall. Member donations covered about 95% of the cost of the building, which cost about $350,000 back in 1999. There are many improvements that have been made to the site over the years, and we have more to come in future years. We're looking at plans to do some improvements there. Once we had the training center, lots of things started happening. In 2000, we had our first meter school. We also had our first transformer school. We put on our first gas school in 2001. The first winter line worker program, which is the cross-training school today. In 2001, we also had our first superintendents and foremen's conference. That's called the Technical and Operations Conference today. In 2002, we had our first substation school, first rodeo clinic. So having the training center there in Marshall was a huge catalyst for us growing our programs. In 2003, we developed the gas circuit rider program. Those of you who have gas systems are quite familiar with it. Basically, the program provides regulatory assistance and training to gas utility members. It used to be there were a couple of inspections a year, and now gas utilities undergo 7 different inspections each year from MinOps. And a big part of our job is helping them prepare for that. Robin Klug, who's pictured there, is our gas circuit rider today. 2004, it was time to move. We moved to 3025 Harbor Lane, where we were for about 15.5 years until a few months ago. It served us well. We also began working with the League of Minnesota Cities Insurance Trust in that year. As you know, the League insures most of the cities around the state, and what we call safety, they call risk management. They could see the impact of the programs we were operating, so we began partnering with them. And in 2008, that led to the development of the Regional Safety Program. MMUA staff provides safety and training services to groups of small towns throughout the state that typically don't have a municipal or gas utility. It's become very popular, and we're serving 200 cities currently in this program. So between that and the regular safety management program, we're serving more than 300 cities around the state. In 2008, we began developing O&M manuals for generation plants. That's been very popular. The league is quite happy with that. And in 2013, we also began doing auditing and consulting for generation plants. In 2005, we developed a finance authority, the Midwest Consortium of Municipal Utilities. We did a couple of bond issues to form what's known as a bond pool. The proceeds were used to finance dozens of local projects. And then the financial meltdown happened in 2008. And the Dodd-Frank law that followed the meltdown had some new requirements that basically made bond pool issuances uneconomic. So we don't do that anymore, but we do work with Northland Securities to get multiple financing programs or proposals for municipal projects. So keep that in mind if you're looking to get multiple proposals for financing. Back in the 2006-2007 timeframe, municipal gas systems in other parts of the country were realizing a lot of savings from issuing gas-exempt tax prepays. We had a meeting with our gas systems here, and we said, you know, should we start doing that? So there was a group that agreed to form a municipal gas agency. The group was Austin, Circle Pines, Hibbing, Hutchinson, Owatonna, New Ulm, and Virginia. We put the agency together in 2007. We were working on a couple of different prepaid transactions when 2008 happened. The financial system melted down, and those kinds of transactions died for quite a while. They have come back since, though, and we're currently working on a prepaid transaction with RBC. Also in 2007, the Minnesota legislature passed stringent new energy efficiency requirements, as well as the new renewable energy standard. We thought, you know, we need somebody with the background to be able to help people out with this. Bob Jagusch, who was the manager at Mora then, a retired Navy commander and ship's engineer, really had the right background for what we were looking for. So Bob came on, he's still with us. He spends a lot of time working with APPA on analyzing complicated rulemakings that the feds put out, does a lot of work in the background. In 2008, we took another run at service territory negotiations. There were some co-op members who wanted to see the issue resolved, so we gave it another try. It was the most extensive and productive set of negotiations we've done. We identified a list of issues to be resolved, and by the last meeting, the group had resolved nearly all of them, and it didn't look like there were any deal breakers left. We left thinking that we were maybe one meeting away from actually working this out, and the co-ops never came back to the table. They just decided that they would pull out. But since most of the necessary areas of agreement had already come together, they provided the basis for a lot of negotiated settlements in the years since. Negotiation or settlements based on those agreements are sometimes referred to as the Marshall Plan, because Marshall was the first municipal to use those principles to agree to a service territory agreement, basically, with the co-ops. Also in 2008, we developed the utility management program. It's typically more of a mentoring program. MMUA will provide an experienced manager to mentor a new manager who has a lot to learn. It's turned out to be a great way to help a new manager get the experience they need to do the job. 2015, a big year for MMUA. We hosted the APPA National Conference in Minneapolis. It was the first time ever that the event was held in Minnesota. We heard lots and lots of nice things about our hospitality, and people love Minneapolis. So I think that they will be coming back to see us again at some point in the future. 2016, MMUA co-hosted the National Public Power Rodeo with Shakopee Public Utilities. The event was at Canterbury Park in Shakopee. You can see a picture of it there. It was the largest APPA rodeo at that time. And we had to be prepared for Minnesota weather. It was on April 1st. So we had the largest tent anybody had ever seen. It was 26,000 square feet. You can see a bit of it there. And we were glad we did, because rodeo day dawned, and a cold front had come in. It had basically blown the back out of our heated tent. Very cold weather, very strong wind. We had a lot of rodeo teams from down south who, for the first time in their lives, learned the meaning of the word wind chill. It was a great event for our public power systems. And we treated it like a mutual aid event. Lots and lots of municipal utilities came together. They sent their crews. We built the rodeo field. I think we started on Monday afternoon, and we had it wrapped up by Wednesday at noon. Lots and lots of hands make easy work. One thing about us and the co-ops, MREA is the Co-ops Association. There was a lot of tension there for a long time, but they have a new GM there, Derek Moe, and things have improved quite a bit in the last few years. We're working very well together on legislative issues, and both the staff and the membership on both sides, I think, have recognized that we're really effective when we work together. So hopefully this bodes well for the future, and we continue to be able to work together. We'll keep our fingers crossed. Now we're in 2020, and something very important happened this year. Our initial 20-year lease was up. We were pleased with the arrangement, so was the city. So they agreed to sell almost all of the land we have been renting, about 18 acres, for $1,000 an acre. We closed on the transaction in February, and this gives us the security to continue making improvements. If we put up another building there, obviously we want to know that we're going to continue to own the land. Now we have that security. And the picture is Cody Raveling, our training center coordinator, formerly a line worker at Marshall, a member of their award-winning rodeo crew. Cody just does a tremendous job for us. And there's the site. The original land we were renting was a rectangle, and you can see in the upper left, the co-op asked to take a little divot out of the rectangle. They've actually since developed an archery range that uses that little corner that they kept. So it's just about 18 acres, and we put it to very good use. We also moved this year again. After about 15 years across the street, the landlord sold that building, and he moved us across the street to another building he owns. We had an existing lease, so we had to do that. The building has been newly renovated. We like our space. We're actually doing an evaluation of whether it might make sense for us to purchase the building. We'll see how that goes, but we're all moved in, so come see us sometime when it's safe to do so. You've already seen this, but we also have developed our new look. I think the logo is going to serve us very well. I'll talk a little bit more about the process that we went through on that tomorrow. And looking to the future, the one thing that you need to know is that MMUA is going to be here. We're going to be there for you. And it's only about 10 more years now we'll be starting our second century of service. It's hard to believe. We know things will change. MMUA is going to adapt and grow as necessary so we can help you meet the challenges ahead. And basically our motto is, we'll do whatever we need to do so you can get the job done. And I can't say enough about the MMUA staff. We have a really strong, talented, dedicated staff, and we're going to continue to maintain that tradition. There's our staff. They are always ready for the next challenge. So thank you very much. I appreciate the time. It's always been, and it continues to be, an honor to be able to represent you and lead this association, and I am very proud to be able to do so. Thank you.